Good evening, friends. Once again, welcome to each one of you in this IND-AS series where we are learning on the important topics on the IND-AS. And today, eminent expert CA Chandni Gupta ji is here. Chandni ji, once again, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Everybody knows about your knowledge, experience in the field of especially IND-AS and IFRS. So once again, welcome to you. And on the repetition, what I would like to introduce once again, Chandni ji is a qualified All India rank holder in CA Finals, CA IPCC, have completed certificate course in IND-AS by ICAI. She secured All India rank 3 in Global Financial Reporting Standard, mainly IFRS. And apart from this, pursuing IFRS from ACCA, London, graduated BCom, secured first rank in senior secondary examination. Apart from this, one of the important figure I would like to say, she authored, I think, 3 books. Chandni ji, am I correct?
It's a co-authored one book and
Achha,
contributed in 2
okay,
books.
okay. So you have done a great in the field of especially IFRS and IND-AS, where you have co-authored comprehensive book on leases. And another book I request you can explain very well about the which books you have authored. But clearly, I would say this session is going to be very fruitful for learning point of view. So we all are here to learn again on the IND-AS 116 leases. So over to you, Chandni ji, for your deliberation and queries we will take up in the last. And one point to be noted that tomorrow's session is cancelled due to some unavoidable circumstances, and we will plan it in the next week. Positively, we will share the detail. So over to you, Chandni ji, for your session.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful introduction and welcome to all the participants in today's session. This session is all about IND-AS 116. I understand you must have attended previous sessions on IND-AS in this series, right? So in this session, we will discuss IND-AS 116, which is only on leases. So let me just quickly share my screen. I request all the participants to be interactive and you can raise your questions. We can answer while discussing the topic or maybe at the end of the session. But you have to be very interactive. So please confirm if my screen is visible. Yes. Okay, great. Yes. So today we are going to discuss IND-AS 116, which is on leases. Leases, we all understand what lease is, right? Rent हम सबने देखा है, lease हम सबने देखा है. Lease is nothing but a contract between two parties. दो parties होती हैं, एक होता है lessor और एक होता है lessee. Just a moment. This pen is not working. Yeah. So there are two parties in a contract of lease. First is lessor and second is lessee, right? इस कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में एक एसेट इन्वॉल्व होता है. उस एसेट को लीज पे देता है लेसर. लेसर इज द ओनर of that asset and gives that asset to lessee on lease, right? इसका सबसे ज्यादा जनरल एग्जांपल कौन सा है? हम लोगों के घर. अगर कोई रेंट पे रहता है, if someone is living on a leased property or a rented property, then you must understand that there is a landlord, right? There is you and there is a contract, which is nothing but a lease agreement or a rent agreement. So in this session, we are going to understand the accounting, the recognition, the measurement, and the disclosure parts of a lease, right? Because a lot of companies are having owned assets, but a lot of companies are also having leased assets, right? They are not buying those assets, but they are taking those assets on lease and using those assets. So since the assets are not owned, hence IND-AS 16, which is on property, plant and equipment, will not be applied, right? So there is a requirement to have a proper guidance on how to account for the assets which have been acquired or obtained on lease, right? So before we move into the IND-AS 116 part, we need to understand its counterpart. So I hope we all understand that as we speak, there are two sets of accounting standards prevailing in India, right? First is the AS, which is nothing but the accounting standards which we all have been studying from the beginning, and second is IND-AS, right? IND-AS and AS के बीच में difference क्या है? So let me tell you, जब IND-AS introduce हुए थे in the year 2015, then leases पे IND-AS issue हुआ था, IND-AS 17, right? So I hope in the first session that was taken by Alok sir, he explained the overview. He gave the entire overview of IND-AS, right? He explained that IND-AS are the converged versions of IFRS. IFRS are what? International reporting standards, right? So international financial reporting standards, and we have converged with them. That means we are more or less similar to the IFRS. So IND-AS is this international version of accounting standards, right? So IFRS, for all the IFRS, we have a counterpart in IND-AS. So earlier there was IAS 17, for which we had IND-AS 17. Now let me tell you that in AS we have AS 19, which is not very different from IND-AS 17. IND-AS 17 और AS 19 में ज़्यादा differences नहीं थे. But in 2019, IND-AS 17 got deleted and new IND-AS was introduced, which was IND-AS 116. Sorry, IND-AS 116. A new standard on leases was introduced. Now, why this standard was introduced? What was the need behind it? Right? So let me explain this to you. So basically, the the new standard was required. Why? Because first of all, in AS 19, or we can say in AS 17, what happened was, for lessee, we'll talk only about lessees, because for lessors the accounting remains same, be it AS 19, IND-AS 17 or IND-AS 116, right? But for lessee, the accounting has changed significantly from IND-AS 17 to IND-AS 116. Now what has changed, right? What has changed? So in IND-AS 17 or AS 19, the lessees were required to classify the leases between finance lease and operating lease, right? फाइनेंस लीज क्या होती है? फाइनेंस लीज ऐसी लीज होती है जिसका नेचर होता है जिसका नेचर जिसका नेचर होता है जिसमें एसेट के risks and rewards भी transfer होते हैं from the lessor to lessee, right? If the risks and rewards associated with the assets are being transferred between lessor and lessee, then in that case the lessor de-recognizes the asset from its book and lessee recognizes the asset in its balance sheet, right? So basically finance lease के case में let me just explain this in Excel. Yeah. So in case of IND-AS 17, and this will be IND-AS 116. IND-AS 17 के case में we are only talking about lessees, right? So lessee was required to classify the lease into, first of all, finance lease and operating lease. In case of a finance lease, they had to recognize an asset and a corresponding liability. Why? Because in lease, the lessee has to make future lease payments, right? That represent a liability, a future liability and obligation. So as on date when asset is received by the lessee will recognize that asset in the books and a liability. Now what this represents in the balance sheet? It represents the lessee has an asset which it is using, and against that asset it has a liability that it will have to make some payments in future. right? Now I think this is very fair, right? Because in lease, in even though it's finance lease or maybe operating whatever, but in lease this is something that is actually happening, right? Lessee is using the asset and it has a future liability. Now, okay, so this was the accounting treatment for finance lease. Now, in case of operating lease, the accounting standard said that you don't have to recognize any asset. The asset does not move from the balance sheet of lessor to lessee. The balance sheet of lessor will still recognize the asset, and lessee के case में only एक expense recognize होगा in the P&L, which is nothing but the lease expense. Right? इसका मतलब ये हुआ that in case of an operating lease, there was no asset or liability. That means all the aviation industry, all the airlines, say Indigo, say Air India, इन सब कंपनीज की बैलेंस शीट में अगर वो एयरक्राफ्ट ऑपरेटिंग लीज पे है तो वो एयरक्राफ्ट उनकी बैलेंस शीट में आ ही नहीं रहा. Right? The aircraft is not even on their balance sheet as an asset. So, to change this, to bring out better transparency, to bring out a better accounting treatment, the international financial reporting, the international accounting standard boards and the US board, which is nothing but FASB, financial accounting standard boards, these two boards worked around this standard and they introduced a new standard, which is nothing but IFRS 16, against which we introduced IND-AS 116. So what they did, they said कि यूएस में कंपनीज अपनी ऑपरेटिंग लीजेस को बैलेंस शीट पे दिखाती ही नहीं है, इवन दो दे हैव एन एसेट, दे आर यूजिंग एन एसेट एंड दे हैव अ लाइबिलिटी, एंड नाइदर द एसेट इज ऑन द बैलेंस शीट nor the liability is on the balance sheet, right? So they worked out around this standard, they changed the standard, and now they said that for lessee classification is not required, all the leases will be treated as same. All the leases are same, except there are two exceptions, so that we will discuss later. But for now we need to understand that now all the leases are same, there is no classification required either for finance lease or for operating lease. For all the assets, the lessee will recognize an ROU asset. What is ROU asset? It's a right of use asset. This asset represents the lessee's right to use that particular asset, and against this there will be a lease liability. So अब हुआ क्या? Now what is the impact of it? The impact is कि जिन जिन कंपनीज के पास ऑपरेटिंग लीज थी, राइट, 2019 1 अप्रैल 2019 से उन सबकी बैलेंस शीट में एक एसेट आ गया और एक लाइबिलिटी आ गई. क्यों? क्योंकि उससे पहले तो उनके बुक्स में एसेट था ही नहीं, लाइबिलिटी था ही नहीं, राइट? नाउ आफ्टर इंट्रोडक्शन ऑफ IND-AS 116, their balance sheets will now have an asset and an additional debt in their liability side. Now my question to everyone here is that due to this change, what will be the impact on the companies? कंपनीज के फाइनेंशियल्स में क्या इम्पैक्ट होगा? कंपनीज के फाइनेंशियल रेशियोज में क्या इम्पैक्ट होगा? व्हाट ऑल रेशियोज विल बी इम्पैक्टेड? I request participants to please be interactive and answer this question. What all financial ratios will be impacted due to this change? Please answer the question. Asset turnover ratio, sales to asset to sales ratio, EBITDA, okay, debt equity, right? So most important is debt equity ratio, which will be impacted, right? Then EBITDA. Now, how the EBITDA is changing? Now, let me explain how EBITDA is changing, right? So, in case of a finance lease earlier, what happened? Asset was recognized and liability was recognized. On this asset, depreciation was recognized, and on this liability, interest was recognized, right? So this is fine. But this expense, in case of an operating lease, the lease expense was an operating expense. It was an operating expense which came above EBITDA. EBITDA is what? Earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. Right? So this expense was booked above EBITDA. Now, when we move to IND-AS 116, again it says there is an ROU asset on which you will recognize a depreciation and a liability on which you will recognize an interest, similar to IND-AS 17 finance lease. Right now, this depreciation will come below EBITDA, right? Because obviously EBITDA is earnings before depreciation, and similarly interest. Why? Because this will be a part of finance cost. So all in all, what has happened? It's not just that the asset and liability have been added to the balance sheet. It's also that now EBITDA has changed. The expense was earlier booked above EBITDA, and now the entire expense in depreciation and interest cost both will be reflected below EBITDA. Right. So the EBITDA, all the ratios related to EBITDA will also change, and the company's key measures, key ratios will be impacted significantly. Right. I hope everyone is clear on that part. If there is any query so far, we can discuss. But I hope now we are clear that why this change was required, right? What the change is, what has been the impact of it. Now we can go ahead and discuss in detail what IND-AS 116 says. Any question, or we can move on? Okay, now moving on. So this we have already understood. There is a change in the definition of leases. There is a control part that has been added. So we will discuss the definition in detail. Now this is a pictorial presentation of what has exactly changed. So for example, we are talking about an airline. So earlier in India 17, in case of a finance lease, there was an asset in the balance sheet, there was a liability in the balance sheet. But for operating lease, there was no asset, there was no liability, right? There was an off balance sheet item. The asset and liability were shown off the balance sheet. They were not shown on the balance sheet. Now, when IND-AS 116 was introduced, this off balance sheet item has moved on the face of balance sheet. Hence, it brings out the transparency, a better presentation of the assets and liabilities of the company, and that is why this change was introduced. Now, again, what is the impact in P&L? As we have already discussed, finance lease, in case of a finance lease, the expenses are shown as depreciation and finance cost, which is below the EBITDA. This is the EBITDA line, right? So this is below the EBITDA. Operating lease, in case of an operating lease, the lease expense was shown above the EBITDA, which has now moved below the EBITDA, right? So this has been the change in or the impact in profit and loss account. Now, what has been the change in or the impact in statement of cash flows? In case of cash flows, earlier the lease expense was shown as a cash outflow from operating activities because the lease expense was an operating expense. But now it will be distributed between operating and financing, since depreciation is not a cash flow. So this number will decrease, and the interest expense will be shown in the financing activities. So hence this will be increased, right? So now, what are the highly impacted industries? So as we understand, the airlines, the oil and gas, since they have huge mines, retailers who have like huge warehouses and warehouses for retailers, telecommunication having huge assets on lease, right? IT. So all these industries were impacted significantly due to the introduction of IND-AS 116. Now we are going to discuss the IND-AS 116 in detail as the standard says, right? So starting with the scope of IND-AS 116, we need to understand that what all is covered by IND-AS 116 and what is not covered. So the standard says that it applies to all the leases, including the subleases, except for leases relating to minerals oil, natural gas, similar non-regenerative resources, because there is a separate standard for this. Then similarly, biological assets which are covered by IND-AS 41, agriculture, service concession arrangements which are covered by IND-AS 115, revenue from contracts with customers, licenses of intellectual property granted by the lessor, right? Then motion picture films, video recordings, plays, manuscripts, patents, copyrights. If there is a lease of these items, that is covered under IND-AS 38 and not here. Also, there is an option to the lessee that it may not apply the standard on any of the intangible assets. So for all the intangible assets, if there is the company has obtained any intangible asset on lease, it may apply IND-AS 38 and not apply IND-AS 116. So that option is also with the lessee. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, that there are two exemptions to the lessees from the accounting treatment that has been given in the standard. So these are the exemptions. First is a short-term lease, and second is a low-value lease. Right? What is a short-term lease? A lease that is having a lease term of 12 months or less. Right? And low-value lease means very low-value leases. The amount is not mentioned in the standard, but it says that the management has to assess on the basis of value when the asset is new. So suppose the company has obtained second hand laptop, right? So the laptop value is very low, but now they will have to compare it with the new laptop. Even though it's second hand, for the purpose of application of this standard, they'll have to evaluate the application of this standard for a new laptop, right? So the examples of low value leases may be the tablets, mobile phones, PCs, right? These are low value leases. So for all these leases, there is an option. This is not mandatory. There is an option that the lessee may not recognize ROU asset and liability for these leases, but it can go ahead and treat it as an operating lease, which was earlier in IND-AS 17. तो IND-AS 17 में पहले operating leases का treatment क्या होता था? Expense was recognized, right, as a lease expense. Now उसमें भी straight line basis लग जाता था. तो similarly short term leases और low value leases को आप straight line basis पे उसका expense recognize कर सकते हैं over the period of lease term. You may not recognize the ROU asset and the liability in case of these two type of leases. Right. So moving on to understand the lease timeline. So we start with the inception date. Now there are two dates which play a very important role in the lease accounting. First is the inception date. So what happens on inception date? Inception date is basically the lease agreement signing date that you can say. Basically, this is the date on which the parties agree to the contract, they understand the terms and conditions, and they kind of commit to those terms and conditions, right? So on this date, what the entities, the lessee and the lessor, what they have to do is they have to identify that there is a lease. So now this is a very, very important aspect, right? First of all, we have to identify if the contract contains a lease or not. There may be a contract in which a party is, leasing out an asset to another party, but as per this standard, we have to evaluate whether this transaction, the renting out of a property or renting out of an asset to from one party to another party, contains a lease or not. How will we evaluate that we will discuss in later slides, but there is a whole lot of concept around it. There has to be a right to control the asset, there has to be an identified asset, right? So all these criteria should be met, and then only we can say that the contract contains a lease, and yes, IND-AS 116 will be applied, right? There may be cases when IND-AS 116 is not applied. Why? Because the lease is not there as per the standard, right? There is a transaction where one party is renting out an asset to another party, but it does not contain a lease as per this standard, right? So for that, the accounting will be very different. The standard will not be applicable to that kind of a transaction, right? So first of all, we have to identify whether the contract contains a lease or not. And then the second task that the lessor has to do, so this is only for lessor. As I told you, the lessees are no longer required to classify the lease into finance and operating lease, whereas the lessor is still required to classify the lease into finance and operating lease, right? So on inception date, the entities will identify the lease and the lessor will classify the lease into finance lease and operating lease. So basically this is a day when we understand the contract, its nature, what the lessor is conveying to the lessee, right? What are the rights, what are the risks and rewards. So it's just all about understanding the agreement and evaluating or assessing the agreement. Now, second date is the commencement date of lease. Now, what happens on this date is the lessor actually makes the asset available for use to the lessee. So, from this date, the lessee is free to use that particular asset, right? And actually, the accounting starts from this date, right? The lease recognition will be done on this date, the initial recognition, and the lease term will be determined starting this date, right? So, that we will discuss in later slides in detail, but for now, we have to keep in mind that there are two dates which are important in lease accounting. First is the inception date of lease, where the parties agree to the terms and conditions of the contract. The parties assess the entire agreement, the contract. They determine whether the IND-AS 116 will be applied or not, and the lessor also assess the risks and rewards in the contract, and whether it will be a finance lease or an operating lease, right? And the second date is the commencement date, on which the lessee is free to use that asset which is under the contract, and they will determine the lease term starting this date, and the initial recognition of the lease happens on this date. So I hope we are clear till this part, because now we will be starting the most important concept of this standard, which is to identify a lease, right? We will understand what are the criteria that that the entities have to take care of while identifying a lease, right? So first of all, by definition, it is lease is nothing but a contract, right, between two parties, where the supplier conveys a right to control the use to the customer, right to control the use, not just the use, but right to control the use of an identified asset. So obviously there will be an asset for a period of time, over the period of time, against a consideration, right? So there are these five factors. First of all, there has to be a contract, then there has to be a right to control the use, right, which the supplier has conveyed to the customer for an asset, an identified asset, over the period of time, which is nothing but a lease term, and consideration, against a consideration, right? So now let's discuss these two definitions in detail, and then we'll go on subsequent slides to understand the lease term and the future lease payments. So, as I said, that right to control the use of an asset is a very, very critical criteria of identifying whether the contract contains a lease or not, right? So, how do we identify whether there is a right to control the use of an asset or not? There are two factors again. First is the right to obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from the use of an identified asset. Now, what did I just say? Um, Basically, this says that the lessee, the customer, has a right in which it can obtain all the economic benefits from that asset, right? It means that it can use that asset in whatever way it whatever way it wants, right? However it wants to use that asset, and whatever the economic benefits can be driven from that asset, चाहे हम उसको बेच चाहे हम उसको यूज करके निकालें या उसको किसी और को दें यूज करने के लिए, किसी भी तरीके से उस एसेट को यूज किया जा सकता है, वो सारा राइट कस्टमर के पास होना चाहिए, right? And right to direct the use of the identified asset. Right to direct kahan se aata hai? If the customer has a right to instruct how and for what purpose that the asset will be used. So let's take an example here. For example, Mr. Rishabh has a shop, right? Mr. Rishabh has obtained a shop on lease. Now it's up it should be up to Rishabh that the shop, what will be the timings of the shop, what he can sell in the shop, right? Whatever he wants to do with the shop, whether he wants to sublease that shop or not. So if all these decisions can be taken by Mr. Rishabh, then we can say that yes, Mr. Rishabh has the right to control the use of that particular shop. Right now, one thing that we have to keep in mind is, if the lessor has put some restrictions on the use, right? So we have to evaluate whether those restrictions are barely in the nature of protective rights. Because suppose the lessor says to Mr. Rishabh that you cannot sell guns in this shop, right? So we understand that this will be a protective right. Why? Because we are living in a residential area and we cannot sell guns, right? Or you cannot sell liquor in this shop. So whatever the restriction has been put on by the lessor, we have to evaluate whether that restriction is a protective right or not, right? Or it may be the case that the jurisdiction is such that it is not allowed to use that asset in that manner, right? So we have to simply evaluate if the scope defined by lessor is justifiable, is protective in nature, right? And then Mr. Rishabh will evaluate whether I can make use of that asset within that defined scope or not, whether I have all the rights to use that asset in whichever way I want within that scope, within that defined scope or not, right? So if the answer to that question is yes, that means Mr. Rishabh has right to control the use of that asset. Right now, it is very important that these rights remain active throughout the period of use. So, for example, the lease term is for 5 years, but Mr. Rishabh can use that asset in any way only for 2 years, and then after 3 years, the lessor will tell Mr. Rishabh that yes, you can only sell, say, groceries in this shop and nothing else, right? Or you can just sell the electrical equipments in the shop and nothing else. So if the rights remain active only for 2 years, then we will say that there is a lease only for 2 years in that contract, right? So it is very important to understand if the rights to control the use is active throughout the period of use or not, right? So I hope this is also clear. So here's just an example or a question. So let's go through this. The question says that a company A has taken a car on lease from a supplier for 5 years. The car is identified in the contract, and supplier has no rights to substitute the car unless it breaks down and requires operational repair and maintenance. That's fine. Company A drives the car or hires a driver, right? Company decides how to use the car as to where it will go and what it will carry, and also has exclusive rights to change these directions throughout the period of use. Supplier prohibits certain uses of the car. For example, maximum limit to drive is 1 lakh kilometers, because beyond that the car will break down. Now the question is whether the company A has a right to control the use of car throughout the period of use. So I request all the participants to please participate and try to give the answer to this question. Yes, so I'm getting a lot of yeses. The answer is correct. Yes, they have the right to control the use of asset, and this restriction to drive maximum to 1 lakh kilometers is just protective in nature. Why? Because after that, the car may break down, right? To In order to avoid the breakdown of that car, supplier has put that restriction, and beyond that, like within that scope, company A can use the car whichever way the company wants, right? So company A has the right to direct the use. Now in this, there is one more important point. Now we understand that right to direct the how and for what purpose the asset will be used should be with the lessee, but it may so happen at times that how and for what purpose these relevant decisions are predetermined in the contract, right? It means when we are signing the contract, it is defined कि अच्छा इस दुकान पे आप यही बेच सकते हो, या फिर इस लैंड पे आप यही बना सकते हो, इसे प्लांट बना सकते हो, और प्लांट में भी आप सिर्फ प्लास्टिक मैन्युफैक्चरिंग बना सकते हो या फिर रबर मैन्युफैक्चरिंग बना सकते हो, राइट? सो ऑल दीज डिसीजंस आर प्री डिटरमाइंड इन द कॉन्ट्रैक्ट, right? It may so happen, But then we have to see that these instructions, the supplier has no right to change these instructions. If the supplier has any such right to change these predetermined decisions or instructions, then there is no right to control the use of an asset by the lessee. Right, but if these instructions cannot be changed in any manner, then we can say that the lessee still has a right to control the use of asset. And another case may be that the asset has been designed in such nature ki for how and for what purpose our asset will be used is automatically predetermined. Why? Because the asset is designed only for lessee, right? So there cannot be any other there is no scope to define any other purpose for that matter, right? So in these cases also, we can say that the lessee or the customer has a right to direct the use of identified asset. Now we need to understand what is identified asset. We have already used this term multiple times, but we need to understand what identified asset exactly is, right? So first of all, the standard says that asset can be explicitly or implicitly defined. Now explicitly defined means that the nature of that asset, the specifications of that asset are mentioned in the contract, right? आप एक ट्रक मैन्युफैक्चरर के पास ट्रक लेने गए, right? That truck manufacturer sells only one type of truck, right? Now even though contract does not mention the number plate of that truck or the color of the truck, we can still say that there is an identified asset. Why? सिंस एक्सप्लिसिटली तो वो मेंशन है ही नहीं, उसके स्पेसिफिकेशंस कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में मेंशन नहीं है, बट स्टिल वी कैन से दैट इट इज आइडेंटिफाइड एसेट. व्हाई? बिकॉज इट इज implicitly identified ना. Because the truck manufacturer with whom we are going ahead and getting the contract signed, that truck manufacturer manufactures only one type of truck. There is no scope कि वो हमें कोई दूसरा ट्रक उठा के दे देगा, right? And that truck meets our requirement. So in that case it is an implicitly identified asset. But agar suppose that was the manufacturer also manufactures cars, motorbikes and etc., तो उस केस में उसको एक ट्रक का स्पेसिफिकेशंस मेंशन करना चाहिए कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में, एंड देन वी कैन से इट इज एक्सप्लिसिटली आइडेंटिफाइड, राइट? सो वी हैव टू बी वेरी केयरफुल while determining whether there is an identified asset or not, right? Also, if the truck manufacturer has a right to replace the truck after 2 years, say the lease term was for 5 years, and the truck manufacturer can come and take the old truck back and give you the new truck. If the truck manufacturer has a right to do that, then there is no lease. Why? Because then there is no identified asset. So the the standard specifically mentions that if the supplier has a substantive right to substitute the asset throughout the period of use, right, throughout the period of use, then there is no identified asset. So if the supplier has a right to substitute the asset, then there cannot be identified asset. Now ये substantive right कैसे होगा? Substitution right should be substantive, right? Then only we'll say there is no identified asset. Now how do we identify whether the substitution right is substantive or not? We have to see the practical ability of the supplier and how economically beneficial that decision will be or the substitution will be, right? Abhi agar suppose company A has taken a machinery on lease, right, from company B. Now that machinery is huge, it's like it's massive, and it is installed at the premises of company A. Now company B has a right to substitute that machinery, but whether there is a practical ability, so practical ability will come from whether company B has a similar type of machinery available which meets all the directions, all the requirements of company A. First question is that. Second is उस मशीनरी को कंपनी ए के प्रेमिसेस से रिमूव करके और नई मशीनरी को इंस्टॉल करना, उसकी जो कॉस्ट आएगी, will that be will company B be in a position to benefit from this kind of a movement, right? So this is a question 2. So we the entities have to evaluate the substantive ness of the substitution rights, right? By evaluating whether it is practical for the supplier to substitute that asset, and second is whether it is economically beneficial for him to do so, right? So these two factors need to be considered, and if this is all clear, then we can say this there is an identified asset, and then we do the right to control the use of assessment. And if these two conditions are satisfied, we give a go ahead and say that the contract contains a lease. All right, so any questions so far? Else we will move on to the concept of lease term. I'm just giving you 1 minute. If you have any questions, you can raise. So Mr. Abhay is asking one question. Is substantive rights are there, then there is no assets. Correct. If there is a substantive substitution right, then there is no asset. Because if suppose a supplier आकर के मशीनरी उठा के ले गया और नई मशीनरी लगा के चला गया, right? तो there is no identified asset, right? वो तो कभी भी आकर के आपकी मशीनरी लेके चला जाएगा. So if there is substantive substitution right, then there is no identified asset and hence no lease in the contract. Any other question? Mr. Atul is asking how we showing the assets in balance sheet in case of operating lease. Sir, there is no operating lease at all now. Operating और finance lease की classification ही नहीं करनी है अब. राइट अगर क्लासिफिकेशन ही नहीं करनी तो ऑपरेटिंग लीज का कॉन्सेप्ट ही खत्म हो चुका है. नाउ देयर विल बी एन आरओयू एसेट और राइट टू यूज एसेट जो कि लेसी को हमेशा रिकॉग्नाइज करना है, वेदर इट्स इन द नेचर ऑफ फाइनेंस लीज और इन द नेचर ऑफ ऑपरेटिंग लीज, इट डजंट मैटर क्योंकि अब क्लासिफिकेशन करनी ही नहीं है. Sometimes lessor prohibits subleasing. What will be the impact on lessee? So if the lessor is prohibiting subleasing, that we have to understand what is the background of it, right? If there is a protective right behind that, then that is fine. We can still say that there is a right to control the asset. But if there is no there is no background behind that, जैसे कि गवर्नमेंट की लीजेस होती हैं उनमें सबलीज प्रोहिबिटेड होता है, राइट? द गवर्नमेंट डज नॉट अलाउ सबलीजिंग. सो दैट इज फाइन बिकॉज वी अंडरस्टैंड कि गवर्नमेंट की प्रॉपर्टी को अगर हम सबलीज करते हुए रहेंगे, सो इट विल नॉट वर्क आउट दैट वेज, राइट? बट अगर कोई नॉर्मल लीज है, गाड़ी की लीज है एंड विद एनी अदर कंपनी, राइट, उसमें सबलीजिंग क्यों प्रोहिबिट करी है, दैट वी नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड. Is there any protective right against that, right? If there is any protective right, we can still say that there is right to control, but if not, then of course we'll have to evaluate it more and take the conclude it accordingly. Mr. Abhay is asking if take it on pure rental basis. Sorry, I'm not clear on your question, Mr. Oh, Mr. Atul is asking that. Yeah, even if we take it on pure rental basis, it doesn't matter. The standard has prohibited the classification of finance and operating lease, right? If even if there is just pure rental basis, we will have to calculate the value of right of use asset and we'll have to recognize the ROU asset. Until unless it's a short term lease or a low value lease, we have to recognize an ROU asset. If in car lease, if only the model is identified, will it be identified as lease? Yes, I think if identification of model is enough to say that yes, this is the car, then I think that will be fine. As DDA flats are on 99 years of lease, so these kinds of assets are also covered in IND-AS 116. Yes, of course. If there is a right to use, then yes, the assets are still covered in IND-AS 116. Okay, and we will have to recognize ROU asset in that case. Mr. Abhay is asking something, and in exception of, is there a question, Mr. Abhay? Substantive rights, those will be assets or not? If there is no substantive substitution right, then it is an asset. Difference between implicit and explicit: explicit means when the specifications of the asset is defined in the contract, it is mentioned in the contract, right? Implicit means the asset is not specified in the contract, the specifications are not mentioned, but we know that when we require, when the lessee will require, the asset will be there and the asset will be as per the requirements. The role of exception in asset, I didn't understand what you're saying. So I can just brief you again, Mr. Abhay. When So first of all, we have to identify the asset, right? Whether it's explicit or implicit. If there is an identified asset, first step done. Then we have to see whether there is any substitution right. All right. If there is any substitution right, then further we'll have to see whether those substitution rights are substantive or not. If the substitution rights are substantive, then there is no asset in the lease. If there is no asset in the lease, there is no lease in the contract, right? Then IND-AS 116 is not applicable. If the substitution rights are substantive, there is no lease in the contract, IND-AS 116 will not be applied. I hope this answers your question. Mr. Brijesh is asking what are the components of cost for ROU, that we will discuss in later slides. Okay, now I guess we are done with the questions. If you have any further questions, you can keep posting. We'll take up after like maybe at the end of the session. So for now, moving on to the lease term concept. What is lease term and how do we determine the lease term? Right. So lease term is nothing but a non-cancelable period. A non-cancelable period, right, which starts with the commencement date. So as I told you earlier, commencement date plays a very important role. It is a date when the asset is available for the lessee, right? And the entities have to determine the lease term from this date, and the initial recognition happens on this date, right? So lease term starts with the commencement date. It includes any rent free period, and if there is a renewal clause, right? Say if the lessee can say the initial contract was signed for 5 years, and the contract says that after at the end of 5 years, they can the lessee can renew it for another 3 years, right? So in that case, the lessee will assess whether it will go ahead and exercise that renewal option or not. If it is reasonably certain that the renewal option will be exercised, then 3 years period will also be included with the 5 year, and the total lease term will be 8 years. But if the lessee is not reasonably certain to exercise that renewal option, then lease term is only for 5 years, right? Then period covered by a termination option. So basically, suppose the contract was initially again for 5 years, and the contract says that after 2 years the lessee can terminate the contract, right? So now the lessee will have to evaluate whether it is reasonably certain to terminate the contract after 2 years. If it is reasonably certain to terminate the contract after 2 years, then non-cancelable period is only for 2 years, right? So lease term will be only 2 years. If it is not reasonably certain to exercise the termination option, then lease term will be for minimum 5 years, right? So I hope this is clear. Now now we need to understand there are certain there may be certain cases with the termination clause. For example, if both the parties have a right to terminate, now what happens in that case, right? If both the parties have a right to terminate, and even like without any penalty, right, there is no penalty also, then the lease term will end on the day when this right becomes exercisable, right? So for example, the contract says that initial period is 5 years, and after 2 years either of the party can terminate the contract, and none of the party will have to incur any major penalty. So for this case, only 2 years is the lease contract, the lease term. Why? Because after 2 years it is like free, both the parties are free to terminate the contract. So non cancelable period will be only 2 years, right? Now, if the lessee has that option that we have already discussed, the lessee will have to evaluate whether it wants to terminate the contract or not. But if only the lessor has that right, to terminate the contract, then it is not considered at all. So, for example, the contract says that it is, for 5 years, and the lessor has a right to terminate it after 2 years. So in that case, the lease term will still be for minimum of 5 years. Why? Because for lessee, it is always assumed that lessor will not terminate it. Right. So when only the lessor has a right to terminate, that termination clause is not considered at all while determining the lease term. Okay, so yeah, now we have a question on this on lease term, so that it is more clear to you all. So let's go ahead. Domino's has taken a property on lease in Gurgaon to open up an outlet, right? And the lease agreement has been made for 5 years, but it also includes a renewal clause for another 5 years, and also a termination clause, wherein Domino's have the right to terminate the lease after the expiry of 3 years from the date of agreement without any penalty. So basically what it is saying is Domino's ने एक property ली है गुड़गांव में अपना एक outlet खोलने के लिए. Agreement has been made for 5 years initially. It includes a renewal clause for another 5 years. That means 5 + 5 is an option, and also a termination clause wherein Domino's have a right to terminate the lease after the expiry of 3 years from the date of agreement. That means either it can be 5 + 5 or it can be 5 - 3, right? So uh, I mean 5 - 2, because after the expiry of 3 years from the date of agreement, right, without any penalty. Now Domino's has done all the interior designing that so that the outlet looks like look similar to all other outlets, because Domino's has a set standard how their outlets look like, right? So they have incurred all the cost. It was huge cost and everything. Now the question says, in case one, Domino's estimates a standing position in Gurgaon market for at least 15 years from now. Right. So basically, what this question is representing, the question is representing that when you're determining the lease term, you have to take care of certain things. What are those things? First of all, the cost incurred by the customer on that property. Right. This particular factor will influence, or will be considered by the customer when deciding whether to renew the agreement or to terminate the agreement, right? So this is one factor that they need to understand. Second factor is obviously the case that has been given, that Domino's estimates a standing position in Gurgaon market for at least 15 years from now. So in this case, what will be the lease term? My question is to you all. डोमिनोज गुड़गांव में बोल रहा है कि मैं एटलीस्ट 15 साल तो यहाँ रुकूंगा, राइट? तो इस केस में हमारा लीज टर्म क्या होगा? व्हेन द कॉन्ट्रैक्ट इज इनिशियली फॉर 5 इयर्स, उसमें एक रिन्यूअल क्लॉज भी है 5 साल का, और एक टर्मिनेशन क्लॉज है जिसमें वो 3 साल के बाद एंड कर सकता है. सो व्हाट विल बी द लीज टर्म इन दिस केस? 10 years, of course. Why? Because obviously फैक्टर वन इज बिकॉज स्टैंडिंग पोजीशन वो देख रहा है गुड़गांव में अपने आप को, राइट. सेकंड इज वो क्यों अपना टर्मिनेट करेगा, उस प्रॉपर्टी को छोड़ के दूसरी प्रॉपर्टी पे भी क्यों जाएगा जब उसने इतनी कॉस्ट इनकर कर ली, राइट. सो दीज टू इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्टर्स आर देयर while डोमिनोज डिसाइड कि इस प्रॉपर्टी इस अग्रीमेंट को टर्मिनेट करना है या नहीं, राइट. सो ऑब्वियसली 15 साल तक वो अपने आप को देखता है तो वो उसको रिन्यू भी करवाएगा. Second case is Domino's is dicey about the location and is not expecting long standing. Now please answer the questions कि इस केस में क्या होगा. 5 years, 3 years, mix of 5 and 3. So that is correct obviously. Why? Because 5 years क्यों होगा? क्योंकि हो सकता है कि वो एटलीस्ट 5 साल तक का तो अपना एस्टिमेट लेकर के चल ही रहा हो, बिकॉज इट हैज ऑलरेडी इनकर्ड अ ह्यूज कॉस्ट, राइट. बट अगर वो 3 साल तक भी नहीं टिक पा रहा है तो वो ऑब्वियसली टर्मिनेशन क्लॉज को एक्सरसाइज करेगा एंड देन विल गेट आउट ऑफ द गुड़गांव. बट इफ एटलीस्ट 3 साल टिक सकता है, राइट, तो वो 5 साल भी और टिक सकता है. सो it will depend on further evaluations and further factors that whether the lease term will be 5 years or 3 years. Okay, so moving on to another concept. So now we are clear on identified asset concept. We are clear on the right to control the use of asset concept. We are clear on the lease term concept. Now we are moving on to the separating components of a contract. So basically ये standard बोलता है कि lessee को नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट्स एंड लीज कंपोनेंट्स को सेपरेट करना है, राइट. नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट्स और लीज कंपोनेंट्स को सेपरेट करना है. नाउ हाउ टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस, मतलब लीज कंपोनेंट क्या होते हैं, नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट्स क्या होते हैं. सो दैट वी विल डिस्कस विद द हेल्प ऑफ एन एग्जांपल, right. So in this question, company A has taken an office building on lease for 20 years. As per the contract, company will make following annual payments. First is fixed lease rental of 1 lakhs, maintenance charges of 50,000, property taxes of 20,000 and building insurance of 10,000. Now the question is, what will be the amount of future lease payment to calculate the lease liability. Lease liability calculate करनी है, इसका मतलब lease component का portion क्या होगा, because अब total payments जो बन रही हैं, राइट, 1,80,000 की टोटल पेमेंट है, तो क्या ये पूरा का पूरा पोर्शन लीज लाइबिलिटी में कवर होगा या फिर इसमें से लीज और नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट्स सेपरेट होंगे. सो दैट इज द क्वेश्चन. सो आई आस्क यू ऑल द पार्टिसिपेंट्स कि क्या इसमें कुछ नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट दिख रहा है आप लोग को. Yes, so what is the non-lease component? Which one is the non-lease component? Insurance, okay. लीज कंपोनेंट क्या होगा, उस एसेट से रिलेटेड. Tax and insurance, property tax. Okay, so everyone is saying tax and insurance, tax and insurance. Okay. So tax and insurance is not the correct answer. The correct answer is maintenance charges. Maintenance charges is not the use of that building. It is an additional service, right? It is an additional service. It is not the use of office building. So this is a non-lease component. Property taxes and building insurance are just accidental to taking that office building on lease, right? Property tax और building insurance कुछ specific service को represent नहीं करते हैं. These are statutory requirements, right? But maintenance charges represents a nature of service altogether. So now how this allocation will be done, how the separation will be done, we understand the total amount is 1,80,000, राइट. लीज कंपोनेंट में बिल्डिंग रेंट आएगा और नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट में मेंटेनेंस सर्विसेज आएंगी. सो इस टोटल अमाउंट को हमें एलोकेट करना है बिटवीन लीज कंपोनेंट एंड नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट. सो लीज कंपोनेंट की स्टैंड अलोन प्राइस क्या है, 1 लाख रुपीज. नॉन लीज कंपोनेंट की स्टैंड अलोन प्राइस क्या है, 50,000 रुपीज. सो इन द रेशियो ऑफ 67 to 33 वी विल एलोकेट दिस टोटल अमाउंट ऑफ 1,80,000 and 1,20,000, which is the 67% of the total consideration, is the lease component. So amount जो lease liability calculate होगी वो 1,20,000 पे होगी. 60,000 represents a non-lease component. So इस तरीके से इसको separate किया जाएगा. Right? So I hope this is clear now. Yeah. Now, future lease payments. Now, as we had discussed कि lease की definition में क्या क्या आता है, contract आता है, right to control the use of asset आता है, identified asset आता है, right, lease term आता है, and consideration आता है. Now we are on the verge of understanding what is consideration. क्या क्या payments हैं जो कि lease liability या ROU asset को calculate करने में consider होंगे, right? So first of all, first is the future lease payments. Future lease payments में क्या क्या आएगा? So when we talk from the perspective of lessee, future lease payment will include the fixed payments, right? जैसे कि every month you have to make a payment of 10,000 or 1 lakh rupees annual payment. So this is a fixed payment, right? Including in substance fixed payments. Now what is this in substance fixed? So for example, suppose the company has taken a machinery on lease, right? And the fixed payment is 10,000 rupees per month. But the contract says that if the machinery produces 1 lakh units, like more than 1 lakh units in any year, from that year, the rents will increase by 10%. So at the beginning of the contract, this is a variable consideration, right? We do not know whether the machinery will exceed 1 lakh units or not. But the day it exceeds 1 lakh units, that 10% escalation becomes fixed, right? Because subsequently all the payments, all the lease rents will be increased by 10%. So now that 10% clause has become fixed. So this is nothing but in substance fixed payment. मतलब कि अभी वो वेरिएबल है बट उसका सब्सटेंस फिक्स्ड है. सब्सटेंस ओवर फॉर्म पे जाएंगे, उसका सब्सटेंस फिक्स्ड है कि एक बार अगर वो इवेंट हो गया तो उसके बाद वो फिक्स्ड की नेचर में होगा, राइट? सो दैट इज व्हाई फिक्स्ड पेमेंट्स विल इंक्लूड द इन सब्सटेंस फिक्स्ड पेमेंट्स लेस एनी लीज इंसेंटिव्स. सो अगर लेसर ने लेसी को कोई लीज इंसेंटिव्स दिया है, सो दैट विल बी डिडक्टेड फ्रॉम द टोटल पेमेंट. Okay, now second is the variable lease payments that depend on an index or a rate measured using a prevailing rate at measurement date. Now variable lease payments depending upon an index or rate. इसका मतलब ये होता है कि if the lease payments are linked to suppose an index or say inflation rate or CPI index or any such market rate or index, right? Then in that case it will be included in the future lease payments. But agar variable lease payment is linked with internal factors, for example turnover of the company or production units of the company, right, इस तरीके के factors पे अगर associated होते हैं future lease payments, then that is not included in the future lease payments. It will be expensed off as and when incurred. फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर हम मॉल्स की बात करें, राइट, मॉल्स के केस में क्या होता है, द शॉप्स रन ऑन टू टाइप्स ऑफ consideration. First is MG, which is a minimum guarantee, and second is revenue sharing, right? So in case of revenue sharing, what happens is, so MG is fixed payment, राइट, एंड रेवेन्यू शेयरिंग के केस में क्या होता है कि महीने का जितना उनका रेवेन्यू होगा उसका X% उसका रेंट होगा, उसको मॉल ओनर को देना है, राइट? सो DLF, टेक फॉर एन एग्जांपल DLF, तो रेवेन्यू का X% शॉपकीपर DLF को पे करेगा. सो इन दिस केस दिस रेंट पेमेंट इज नॉट कंसिडर्ड एज फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट. अब ये फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट हम बार बार क्यों समझना चाहते हैं? बिकॉज फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स विल determine the lease liability. Present value of future lease payments is the value of uh, lease liability, राइट? तो अगर ये फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स का पार्ट नहीं है, इसका मतलब कि ये लीज लाइबिलिटी का पार्ट भी नहीं है। लीज लाइबिलिटी का पार्ट नहीं है, इसका मतलब कि ये आरओयू एसेट का भी पार्ट नहीं है। ऑलराइट, सो रेवेन्यू शेयरिंग बेसिस या फिर किसी और रेट या इंडेक्स पे बेसिस अगर लीज रेंट होता है, which is internal factor, internal measure, then that is not considered in calculation of lease liability. Right, then third is the exercise price of a purchase option. So suppose the lessee has an option to purchase that asset, say at the end of the lease term, and it is reasonably certain that it will buy that asset at the lease at the end of lease term. So उस asset की जो exercise price होगी, उसकी present value भी lease liability में included होगी, right? That is why we have considered the exercise price. यहाँ पे exercise price of the purchase option is also considered in future lease payments. Similarly for the penalties, so if there is a termination option and there is any penalty associated with that termination, and a lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that termination option, तो उसकी जो penalty है, that is also included in the future lease payments और उसकी present value भी lease liability में consider की जाएगी, right? Then fifth is the residual value guaranteed by the lessee. तो अगर lessee ने कोई residual value guarantee दी हुई है, that is also included in the future lease payments and will be considered in lease liability. Now, these five points are from the point of view of the lessee. Now, this is the only differentiating factor between future lease payments for lessee and future lease payments for lessor. What is this? This is residual value guaranteed to the lessor by a third party related or unrelated to the lessee. मतलब कि lessee ने खुद गारंटी नहीं दी है, किसी और ने गारंटी दी है लेसर को, तो लेसर उस पेमेंट को अपने लिए कंसिडर करेगा। लेसी की कैलकुलेशन यानी कि लेसी की लाइबिलिटी नहीं है वो, तो लेसी के लिए दैट इज नॉट रेलेवेंट, राइट? सो लेसी के लिए हम यहाँ पे फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स कैलकुलेट करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, विच विल डिटरमाइन द लीज लाइबिलिटी फॉर लेसी, एंड लेसर के लिए यहाँ पर हम फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स कंसिडर कर रहे हैं टू कैलकुलेट द नेट रिसीवेबल. सो बेसिकली अकाउंटिंग दैट वी विल डिस्कस इन फ्यूचर स्लाइड्स, बट जस्ट टू गिव अ कॉन्टेक्स्ट, लेसर की बुक्स में क्लासिफिकेशन होगा बिटवीन फाइनेंस लीज एंड ऑपरेटिंग लीज, राइट? फाइनेंस लीज के केस में एसेट डी रिकॉग्नाइज होगा और एक रिसीवेबल रिकॉग्नाइज होगा. सो उस रिसीवेबल की वैल्यू क्या होती है? उस रिसीवेबल की वैल्यू होती है प्रेजेंट वैल्यू ऑफ द फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स, फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स फॉर द लेसर. सो उस केस में ये पांचों पॉइंट प्लस ये छठा पॉइंट, इन 6 पॉइंट्स की प्रेजेंट वैल्यू विल बी द receivable that will be recognized in the books of lessor. So that we will discuss in later slides, but just to set a context. So any query? Well, let me just have a look at the, but maintenance may also be fixed. If maintenance I spend with rent, then how will we calculate? Yes, so Mr. Atul is asking, maintenance may also be fixed. Yes, maintenance may also be fixed, but it is a non-lease component, right? It is a separate service. Okay, I've lost. Whether we'll calculate present value or residual value here? Yes, we will calculate present value of all these 5 or 6 pointers, because this is a future lease payment. No, it will be made in future. So all the payments that will not be made on day 0, we will have to calculate the present value of all of them. Any question, any doubt? on which rate we calculate present value. So that is the second slide, like next slide. So we will discuss. Any other questions so far? There are no questions. Okay, so let's move on. Yeah. So this we have discussed. Now this is the interest rate that we will use to calculate the present value of all the future lease payments. Now what is this rate? So the standard says that the lessee has to use the lessee and lessor both have to use interest rate implicit in lease. Now what is this interest rate implicit in lease? This is nothing but IRR. This is a rate at which the net investment in lease, which is the sum of present value of lease payments accruing to lessor plus present value of unguaranteed residual value, is equal to the fair value of asset plus any initial direct cost. So this is a rate at which net investment in lease is equal to the fair value of asset plus if there is any initial direct cost, right? But practically what happens is generally this rate is not very easily calculated by the companies, right? So what they do is they use lessee's incremental borrowing rate. So the standard also allows this. Standard says that if the rate cannot be readily determined, if this interest rate implicit in lease cannot be readily determined, then you can use the lessee's incremental borrowing rate. What is this incremental borrowing rate? So if the lessee is going to take a property on lease, then incremental borrowing rate will be an interest rate that will be applicable to take a loan to buy a similar property, राइट? सो अगर लेसी उसी तरीके के सिमिलर एसेट को खरीदने के लिए जाएगा या उसी सिमिलर एसेट को खरीदने के लिए लोन लेने जाएगा, तो उसकी क्या बोरोइंग रेट होगी? दैट विल बी द लेसीज इंक्रीमेंटल बोरोइंग रेट दैट वी कैन यूज टू कैलकुलेट द future lease payments, I mean the present value of the future lease payments. Now, initial direct cost is nothing but an incremental cost of obtaining a lease that would not have been incurred if the lease had not been obtained, right? For example, the commission that we pay, the legal fees, the documentation cost, right? The payments to existing tenants to move out, consideration for a guarantee to an unrelated third party. So all these are incremental cost of obtaining a lease, right? What is not an initial direct cost is employee salary, because you anyway have to pay it whether or not you obtain that lease. Legal fees for services rendered before the execution of lease, right? Because जब तक एग्जीक्यूट ही नहीं हुआ तो वो कॉस्ट आप एनीवे इनकर करते, चाहे ये लीज नहीं लेते दूसरी लीज लेते. सो द कॉस्ट that has been incurred to obtain that particular lease, that is only considered as initial direct cost. अगर आप किसी और लीज को लेने के लिए वो कॉस्ट इनकर कर रहे हैं, या सपोज आप जस्ट कॉस्ट इनकर करिए एंड यू डोंट हैव अ लीज एट ऑल, तो वो कॉस्ट इज नॉट एन इनिशियल डायरेक्ट कॉस्ट. फॉर एग्जांपल नेगोशिएटिंग लीज टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस, तो इस स्टेज पे देयर इज नो लीज इन एग्जिस्टेंस, राइट? यू हैव नॉट ऑब्टेन्ड अ लीज एज ऑफ नाउ. जब आप वो लीज ले लेंगे तब वो कॉस्ट उस लीज को लेने के लिए पर्टिकुलरली जो कॉस्ट इनकर हुई होगी, दैट वुड हैव बीन कंसिडर्ड एज इनिशियल डायरेक्ट कॉस्ट, बट यू आर जस्ट नेगोशिएटिंग द लीज टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस, so it may or may not mature, right? Then advertising, depreciation and amortization, so these are not initial direct costs and will be expensed off as and when incurred. Now we come to the treatment, accounting treatment in the books of lessee. So this is the accounting treatment since we have already understood. So just to give a recap, a quick recap. In case of IND-AS 116, which is the new standard prevailing in India, for companies which are applying IND-AS. For lessees, the classification of lease between finance and operating lease is no more done, right? That classification is prohibited. For all the leases, there is one accounting treatment in which the lessee has to recognize a right of use asset and a corresponding lease liability. Only two exceptions are: first is the short term lease, which is a lease for 12 months or less, and second is the low value lease, which is a lease for assets having low value, right? So for all other leases, it doesn't matter whether it's finance lease or operating lease, because the question of classification is not there, right? So for all the leases, the lessee has to recognize an ROU asset in the balance sheet and a corresponding liability in the balance sheet. Now, what is the value of this ROU asset and what is the value of this lease liability? So for starting with the lease liability, this is nothing but the present value of future lease payments to lessee using interest rate implicit in lease. So we have understood the future lease payments, we have understood the interest rate implicit in lease, or the lessee's incremental borrowing rate, right? So using this rate, we calculate the present value of the future lease payments from the point of view of the lessee. That's how we calculate the value of lease liability. Now, since lease liability can only be calculated for future lease payments, so if you have made any payment in advance or any payment made on day zero when we are recognizing ROU asset, that payment will be included in ROU asset, right? So all these components will make up to the value of ROU asset. So lease liability is one component. Second component is any amount paid on or before the commencement date. Third, any initial direct cost incurred by the lessee. Fourth is the very important part, which is nothing but the estimate of cost to be recognized only when lessee incurs, the provision for dismantling or removing the underlying cost. So what is this exactly? This is the question. So this is driven by IND-AS 16 also. So if you have understood or gone through IND-AS 16, property, plant and equipment, you must have seen the provision for dismantling or provision for removing the asset, right? So similarly in IND-AS 116, if the lessee has an obligation to remove or dismantle the asset at the end of lease term, and lessee can estimate a cost associated to that, that the present value of that dismantling cost will also be included in ROU asset, and a corresponding provision will be created for that asset, right? So for example, a company has obtained a land on lease from government, and the lease is for 30 years. The government says that after 30 years, like the company will build a building on that land, but the government says that after 30 years you have to return this land as it is to us. So after 30 years, the company will have to dismantle that building, remove that building, restore the land, right? So the cost of dismantling the building, restoring the land will be huge, right? So there might be say 50 lakhs, the estimate can be of 50 lakhs. So after 30 years, when lessee knows that it will have to incur 30 lakh rupees, so it will calculate the present value of those 30 lakhs to day zero, calculated it in the value, included it in the value of ROU asset, and correspondingly recognize a provision. So, so this is how you calculate the ROU asset, lease liability, and all other miscellaneous things. So, any question in this? Advance payment is also to be recognized or not to be recognized. Advance payment will be included in the value of ROU asset. The entry will be ROU asset to bank or cash or the supplier. Please repeat the calculation of IRR. used in present value. We will do that maybe after this slide. Let like everyone else can ask questions on this slide, and then we can recap the IRR part. Okay, assuming no questions, giving a quick recap of the interest rate as requested by Mr. Atul. So, interest rate implicit in lease is a rate at which the net investment in lease. Net investment, what is the value of net investment? The present value of lease payments accruing to the lessor, that means those 6 points, plus the present value of any unguaranteed residual value. So these two payments will make up to the net investment in lease. So the rate at which net investment in lease is equal to the fair value of asset is the rate that we have to use for calculation. But if this rate is not like easily determinable, then lessee's incremental borrowing rate can be used. Mr. Rishabh is asking, is there any method defined for estimate cost for dismantling, or it's a company estimation? It's absolutely a company estimation. Provision for dismantling will be at NPV or total estimated cost. It will be the total estimated amount. I mean, whatever cost that the company expects to incur. Okay, so we have understood the initial recognition. We understand that lessee has to recognize an ROU asset and a lease liability. Lease liability is nothing but the present value of future lease payments using an interest rate implicit in lease or a lessee's incremental borrowing rate. And ROU asset is a sum of lease liability, any advance payments made, any initial direct cost incurred, or any provision for dismantling. Now, subsequent measurement, coming to the subsequent measurement, because on 31st March or any reporting date, 30th June or whatever your reporting period is, on that date you have to do a subsequent measurement. What is subsequent measurement in this case? So initially you have recognized ROU asset, right? For ROU asset you will have to depreciate it, because every asset is depreciated, right? So the standard says you can apply either the cost model or you can go ahead with the revaluation model, right? So in case of cost model, the depreciation is charged, and the carrying amount of ROU asset will be cost less accumulated depreciation less accumulated impairment, right? And the depreciation period, this is the important factor. Depreciation period will be the useful life of asset. Now, the question may arise, while useful life, why not the lease term? So, useful life of asset only if the lessee intends to purchase the asset. Otherwise, it will be the earlier of useful life or the period of use or the lease term, right? So the depreciation period will be essentially the lease term or the period of use. But if the lessee wants to, like, intends to purchase that asset at the end of the lease term and has an option to do that, then the entire useful life of the asset will be used to calculate the depreciation. Depreciation on the straight line basis, apply IND-AS 16 on this. So that will be driven by IND-AS 16. The companies can also apply revaluation model on the ROU asset. The one condition is that it has to apply revaluation model to the entire class of ROU asset or the PPE to which it belongs, right? What is a class? Class means a similar, a group of assets which have similar use to the company. For example, furniture, fixtures, plant and machinery. So these are classes. Then what will be the subsequent measurement of lease liability? So in case of a lease liability, it will be the movement will be due to payments by the lessee, right? So the amount will decrease due to the actual lease payments, but it will increase due to the interest charge, because since it is a present value of future lease payment, so we will have to accrue the interest every year, so that at the end the lease liability becomes equal to the the last payment that lessee has to make, basically the time value of money. When using revaluation model, depreciation is also provided on SLM. Yes, so that depends when you are doing the revaluation. The date of revaluation will be important in that case. Okay. So this is done. Now, coming to the treatment, accounting treatment in the books of lesser. So as I've mentioned multiple times already, that lesser needs to classify the lease at inception between the finance lease and operating lease. Finance lease is a lease that basically in which the lesser transfers substantially all the risks and rewards incidental to the ownership of asset, and operating lease is the the other leases that in which the risks and rewards are not transferred. So, in case of finance lease, the lessor will have to de-recognize the asset from the books at the carrying amount and will recognize a receivable which is at the net investment in lease. Right? And what is net investment in lease? It is the present value of future lease payments from the point of view of lessor. Right, so the lessor will de-recognize the asset and recognize a receivable against it, and any difference will go to profit and loss account. In case of operating lease, any initial direct cost will be added to the carrying amount of asset because the asset is already there in the balance sheet of lessor. So the initial direct cost, if any incurred, will be added to that asset and will be amortized over the period of lease term, because the lease income will also be recognized over the period of lease term. So this is subsequent measurement in which the lease receivable will be decreased by the actual receipts of lease payments over the period of lease term and will be increased with the interest income, because since net investment is also present value of the receivable, so interest income will be accrued and it will be recognized in P&L, right? And operating lease income recorded in P&L on straight line basis or any other systematic basis. So this was the treatment in the books of lesser. I hope this is clear. If there is any doubt, please raise the questions. Please let me know if there is any doubt, else we'll move on. Mr. Atul is asking, so rental expenses treatment in books of lessee. No, lessor. Rental expenses, so lessee. That will be the actual payments will be adjusted in the lease liability, and only the interest charge will be recognized in P&L. Any other doubt? Interest and depreciation on asset also. Yeah, please give example. Yes, interest and depreciation will be recognized in P&L. So, Mr. Atul, for example, if you want to take an example, so it will be practical mostly, but we can take a quick example. Uh, okay, let's take a practical example. For example, the lease term is for say 3 years, right? Annual lease payment. I hope this is visible to all. annual lease payment of 1 lakh rupees, right? Now there is party A and party B, and incremental borrowing rate or the interest rate implicit in lease is 10%. Now how will we account for it? So let's take year 1, right? Since there are 2 years, so 3 years, the payments or the cash flow will be 1 lakh annual. Okay, and the payment is made say at the beginning of the, like, 1st Jan को payment हो रहा है. So present value factor at 10% will be 0 for this, because the 1 for this, because the payment will be made on day 0, right? For this we have to calculate the present value like this, raised to the power year, like this will be 0, actually 1 and 2, right? Because we are making 3 payments at the beginning of each year, right? So this is how it will look. Payment time, we can say year 1, 2 and 3. Right now the present value of the future lease payments is 2,73,553. Now how the lessee will account for it? Will recognize an ROU asset, debit, credit, a lease liability. This is on day 0. Okay, a lease liability. Right, and now also we have to make this table. Opening balance, then payment, then interest, and then closing balance of lease liability. Payment is 1 lakh per annum. Interest is opening balance plus the actual payment that is done into the, because closing balance pay, like after adjusting the payment, we will recognize an interest. Now this is the closing balance. This is how the table will look like for recognition of interest and lease payments. Now on day 0, what else we have done is we have made the payment, right? So bank account 1 लाख रुपए की हमने payment करी है यहाँ पे, right? And at the end, so ये payment जो हुई है यहाँ पे lease liability debit हो जाएगी, and there will be an interest expense or lease liability credit होगी, right? With what amount? 17,000. First year का interest. So this is at the end of year 1. Now at year end 2, now there will be one more entry, ROU का depreciation, right? So depreciation ROU क्या amount होगा? SLM basis पे अगर लेके चलेंगे तो ROU divide by 3, right? So this will be the accounting. Then similar entries in year 2, beginning of the year पे again payment की entry होगी. This similar entry will be done. And at the end of the year, these 2 similar entries will be done. Interest expense for second year will be 9,991. And the depreciation will be same. Right, now year 3. Again, the same entries at the beginning, 1 lakh rupees ki payment. And at the end, इंटरेस्ट एक्सपेंस 0 है तो वो रहने देते हैं, एंड depreciation इतने का. Now let's see the balances at the end of year 3. Lease liability में initially we had recognized 2,73,000, इसमें से 1,00,000 adjust हुआ, 17,000 का इंटरेस्ट अक्रू किया. सेकेंड ईयर में फिर एक पेमेंट हुई, इंटरेस्ट अक्रू किया. फिर थर्ड ईयर में वापस से एक पेमेंट हुई, तो लीज लाइबिलिटी हैज बिकम 0. आरओयू एसेट की बात करें, इनिशियल रिकॉग्निशन किया था 2,73,000 का, उस पे डेप्रिसिएशन लगा 91,000 का इन द फर्स्ट ईयर, 91,000 in the second year, 91,000 in the third year. So ROU has also become 0. So this is how the accounting entries will flow in the books of lessee. For lessor, it will depend whether it's a finance lease or an operating lease. So I hope this is clear now, Mr. Atul, if this is clear. So we have seen that interest and depreciation, these will be recognized in the P&L, right? Okay. So now moving on, the lease liability may be required to be remeasured, right? अगर कुछ changes होते हैं, for example, lease term में change होता है, या फिर option to purchase की reassessment होती है, right? So in these cases, what the lessee has to do, it will measure a revised discount rate, okay, basis the factors that have changed. And if there are changes such as amounts expected to be payable under a residual value guarantee, या फिर future lease payments, मतलब variable lease payments में कुछ change है, in substance fixed बनता है, so the original discount rate will be used, but the lease liability will be reassessed. And when the lease liability is reassessed, the adjustment is done in the ROU asset. If the ROU asset has already become 0, then it will be adjusted in the profit and loss account. Right. Then there can be a lease modification. Lease modification basically is a change in scope of lease. That means if the consideration has changed, or the additional asset has been added to the lease agreement, or an or an asset has been deleted. Right. Suppose पहले 5 कार थी, अब 4 ही कार रह गई हैं, या 5 की जगह अब 6 कार हैं. So if there is any such modification, then basically the lessee will have to see whether it's an increase in scope. इसका मतलब कि additional asset आया है. Additional asset आया है तो क्या consideration increase हो रहा है as per the standalone price of the additional asset? If yes, तो एक separate lease बन जाएगी और separately accounting होगी. But if additional asset has been added, but the price is not the consideration is not increasing as per the standalone price, तो lease liability की remeasurement होगी and adjustment will be done in the ROU asset, right? Similarly, for if there is an increase in the lease term, but if there is a decrease in lease term, or there is a decrease in scope, यानी कि एक asset delete किया है, in that case what happens, ROU asset and lease liability is de-recognized in proportion to say पहले 5 flats थे, अभी 2 flats हटा दिए हैं, तो total value say X amount into 2 divided by 5. So इस तरीके से proportionately amount को de-recognize करेंगे, and any gain or loss will be recognized in P&L. Right. Now, lease of a land and building, अगर suppose land and building एक साथ आता है, so now what happens is lesser को तो classification करनी है into finance and operating lease, but land has an indefinite useful life and building has a definite useful life. So land is generally in the nature of a finance lease, but for building they'll have to see whether it's a finance lease or an operating lease, right? So ulta bol diya, land will be an operating lease because it has an indefinite useful life, but building can be operating or finance lease. So it will depend if the proportion, like they will have to separate these two, land and building में को अलग अलग किया जाएगा. The values will be separated basis the standalone prices of both the two items. But if the value of land is immaterial in proportion to the building, in that case building का जो भी classification होगा, that will overrule the classification of land. So this was just a small clarification. Then again, this standard gives guidance on sale and leaseback transactions. Sale and leaseback के केस में क्या होता है, suppose company A has sold a machine to company B, right? This is a sale, this is a pure sale transaction. But then company A again takes back the machine on lease. This is a lease transaction. So the seller has become a lessee and the buyer has become a lessor. So इस केस में accounting कैसे होती है? When they are recognizing the sale transaction, the gain on sale is restricted to the rights that have been transferred, right? So the standard also gives a guidance on how to calculate the the gain that pertains to the rights that have been transferred. Then another concept in this standard is of sublease. Sublease may there is a trick. So I'll tell you what sublease is. Sublease is, say a company A ने company B को एक machine lease पे दी, right? Company B ने company C को फिर वो machine transfer कर दी sublease में. अब क्या होगा, कंपनी ए और कंपनी बी के बीच में, कंपनी ए इज द लेसर, it will do a classification between finance lease and operating lease. Company B is a lessee, so it will recognize an ROU asset, right? But in case of a sublease, company B has become a lessor, so it will have to do a classification of sublease into finance lease and operating lease, and sublessee has become a lessee, so it will recognize an ROU asset. Now the question is on company B, because एक जगह ये लेसी है और एक जगह ये लेसर है, तो लेसी के लिए लेसी की अकाउंटिंग के हिसाब से आरओयू एसेट रिकॉग्नाइज हुआ, बट नाउ सबलीज के लिए उसको लेसर बना दिया गया, तो वहां पे उसको सबलीज की क्लासिफिकेशन करनी है बिटवीन फाइनेंस लीज एंड ऑपरेटिंग लीज, राइट? सो now the question is, suppose the machine has a life of 15 years, right? And this initial lease was for 10 years. So when company B will do a classification, so whether sublease, say sublease is for 5 years, so whether it will compare 5 years with 10 years or will it compare 5 years with 15 years to identify whether it's a finance lease or an operating lease. सो द स्टैंडर्ड सेज कि ये 5 साल को आपको 10 साल से कंपेयर करना है. क्यों? क्योंकि बी के पास राइट सिर्फ 10 साल तक का है. सो बी कैन सबलीज समथिंग दैट इट हैज, जो उसके पास है ही नहीं, उसको वो सबलीज कैसे कर सकता है, राइट? सो बी हैज द राइट टू यूज दैट एसेट ओनली फॉर 10 years. सो between these 10 years, like from this 10 years, it is subleasing for further 5 years. So for the classification of sublease into finance lease and an operating lease, the lessor will bifurcate, the lessor will compare the lease term of sublease with the lease term of ROU asset that it has, right? So this was the googly in this concept. So we are done. This was essentially IND-AS 116. I thank you all for carefully listening to me for last 2 hours. If you have any doubts now, we can take, or you want me to revise any concept. Accounting treatment of sublease in case of lessee. So it is same, accounting treatment is same, only factor that is different, as I just explained, कि जब intermediate lessor यानी कि B को classification करनी है, तो वो compare किससे करेगा period को, बस यही difference है. बाकी sublessee will recognize an ROU asset, B once will recognize an ROU asset, and then जब वो लीज आउट करेगा सब लीज पे, तो इट विल डिपेंड. अगर फाइनेंस लीज है सब लीज, तो वो आरओयू एसेट को डी रिकॉग्नाइज करेगा. ऑपरेटिंग है तो आरओयू एसेट रहेगा बुक्स में, राइट? सो इट इज ऑल सेम. Mr. Vinith is requesting to unmute. He has a practical case. So, Mr. Vinith, I request if you can connect with me personally, because I don't think we have that much time to discuss a practical case here. I would rather ask others to ask a conceptual query so that it can be useful for everyone. If you have a specific case, we can definitely discuss in person. You can note down my number and then we can discuss. I hope that helps.
Hi, Chandni. This is Vineet. This case will also enable other users also to understand
Okay.
one of the transaction which we are going through in a company. I will not disclose the name of my company and transaction, but
Okay.
this is a very practical case.
Okay.
I have an EPC contract with a. Suppose I am A and I am for a big project with a party B,
Okay.
and for supply of a particular equipment, I have entered into an agreement with the party C.
Okay.
Okay. So suppose 100 rupees is the total EPC contract. Out of 100 EPC, 100 rupees contract, I have entered an agreement of 10 rupees of equipment supply with party C.
Okay.
So party C has now, and I have to pay 10% of interest during construction to this party C for that lease. And that asset will, once equipment will be ready, it will transfer, that party C will transfer me that asset to me on the lease.
Okay.
Okay, and the it will be part of that EPC contract only. So my question is, suppose party has A has completed work related, party C has completed work related to 2 rupees only.
Your voice is breaking a little bit.
Sorry, sorry for trouble. The suppose party C has completed out of 10 rupees of equipment, it has partly installed 2 rupees of equipment at my location, and now it is asking me 10.2% interest. So what will be the accounting treatment in my book? Since my partly CWIP has been carried out already, should I recognize CWIP and lease liability also corresponding to that in my books, or I will only recognize the interest cost which I am paying as interest during construction as of now?
Oh, so to be honest, I couldn't understand the entire case here, but I think CWIP and lease liability will have to understand this case, because looks very specific to the construction,
Yeah,
right? So I think there will be an application of construction contract plus the lease, if there is any lease. First of all, the question is if there is any lease,
yeah, lease
right?
is there because that equipment ultimately is going to lease it back to me.
No, even though the equipment will be like company C will transfer the equipment to company A on lease, right?
Yes, yes.
Right. So for that, they will recognize an ROU asset.
But since as of now it is partly complete, I cannot reuse it as a complete asset. But it is
Then there is no lease recognition. Lease recognition will start when the asset is available for use by the lessee.
so if my project is though work is partly completed out of project, I should not recognize my civil.
Why is it your CWIP? I mean, the company C is constructing that asset for you, right?
Yes.
Then why are you going to recognize anything? Company C will recognize. You will recognize the ROU asset once you have the
Since
asset.
so only my only submission is that my recognition and my end will only start at
When the at the
complete asset is
commencement
transferred.
of lease, when the asset is available. So there can be other angles in this case that maybe we are not able to discuss here, but that is why I'm saying we can connect personally on this.
Okay,
But
sure.
prima facie, it looks like that the lease will start only when the asset is available to the lessee,
But
right?
EDC I can recognize the 10% cost interest cost which I am paying to it. during construction.
Yeah, that factor we'll have to discuss in detail. Why is that happening? How it is linked, right? So that
Okay,
we
so I
can.
will connect to you
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Sure, sure.
maybe tomorrow I will connect to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your.
Any other query by participant relating to this topic? Can we discuss in 2-3 minutes? Then we will close the session. Chandni ji, I think all the topic you have covered, there is no such other query. You have well covered the topic. So anything you want to say before concluding?
Yeah, so I would like to thank all the participants for listening to the session. This standard is actually very important since it is a new standard also, kind of, although 2 years have already passed by,
Yes.
but still for a lot of people it's new. So this is like very critical. So if you have any questions, you can come to me. That's fine. But yes, thanks for listening, and thanks to Team Casa for organizing this series and giving me the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandni ji, and thank you for your wonderful session as always. And definitely one query is there regarding pendency of the IND-AS 2 inventory, and that will be covered in the next 6 session. So definitely we will cover entire things, and anything you want to convey me, anything left further
I
you want
think
to
there is
discuss.
one query Mr. Tushar
Mm,
is asking. I'll just take that,
mm,
sir.
mhm. Each
Sir,
ARO,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Is ARO also to be factored in IFRS
Mm,
16? So yes, the while we were discussing the value of ROU asset, we saw
mm,
provision for dismantling. That is nothing but ARO, right? And
okay.
IFRS 16 and IND-AS 16 are same. So yes,
Okay.
it is covered. Yeah.
So now it is time to conclude, and especially thanks to Chandni for your wonderful session.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.